Hello friends, it's Siobhan here, just dropping in at the start of this episode. I just felt that it was really important for me to say a few words before you start listening to the episode of this fortnight's Knowing Animals. This episode features Laurie Levy from the Coalition Against Duck Shooting in Victoria. I actually recorded this episode at the very end of last year, 2019. I was in Melbourne and I thought it was really important to grab Laurie and have a discussion about what he's been doing to try and help ducks and to try and stop duck shooting in Victoria for many, many decades. As you're going to hear, Laurie is a real champion of the animal protection movement, and I really wanted to capture his story. But at the time we recorded this episode, we had not even thought for 1 second that we would be facing a global pandemic. We'd certainly never heard of coronavirus, and it was the furthest thing from our minds. So when you listen to this episode, please remember that this is a little bit out of context. I know that for the moment, a lot of people are very, very focused on coronavirus, and I'm not at all surprised at that. It is truly a very upsetting and difficult time, and I have everything crossed that everyone around the world who has engaged with this podcast, your friends, families, animal studies scholars, academics, in fact, the global community, are staying safe, and I hope that we all come through the other side as well as we possibly can. The other thing I wanted to say was that it was announced in February that Victoria would go ahead with its duck shooting season. There was going to be a few slight modifications to duck shooting in 2020 to take account of the fact that Victoria has had a really terrible drought, and there was a slight reduction in the number of birds that could be taken, etc., etc. Of course, since then, events have really sped ahead, and now we're talking about people not meeting in groups. We're talking about shutting down a whole range of services. And I really hope that this means that actually the duck shooting season will not go ahead in Victoria in 2020. I just had a little look online before I started recording this, and I can't see any notification of that. But it is my hope that the government deems it not appropriate for the enforcement officers to be out and about, for the shooters to be camping together and spending time together, and indeed the duck rescuers who go every year and provide really important veterinary and rescue services to the ducks, trying to make sure that they aren't together at this time of social distancing and self-isolation. So I hope that perhaps one silver lining of this terrible situation we find ourselves in is that duck shooting doesn't go ahead in 2020, but I'm yet to actually see that advice. The other thing I wanted to say to you while I've got your attention before the proper episode starts is that I am determined to keep the podcast going throughout this whole crisis. I am someone who really enjoys podcasts, and I know that there will be a lot of people who will be isolated at home, either on their own or perhaps with one or two other people, and distraction and entertainment and things to even stimulate discussion among the people that you're isolating with is going to be critically important. So I really do want to keep the show going. Now, clearly, I'm not going to be able to do face-to-face interviews. I've recorded all my interviews until Monday, May 4th, and after that time, I will need to record new interviews. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start recording the interviews online. So I'm going to record them via, online technology, whether that be Skype or Zoom or whatever else. So that actually means that instead of doing the interviews face-to-face, which is what I've done previously, I've just done interviews with people that I can grab opportunistically at conferences, or if they're in Sydney or if I'm traveling, etc. I'm now really going to be able to interview anyone around the world at any time. So if you're an animal studies scholar and you are interested in coming on the podcast and you've never been on before, or you've been on once, a while ago, or even twice a while ago, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me in multiple ways. You can reach out to me via the Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan Facebook page or via the Knowing Animals Facebook page. You can also email me at my institution's email address, or you can send me a message or a tweet via Twitter at either my own personal Twitter account, which is at SO_S, or at Knowing Animals. So please take this opportunity. If people don't come forward, I'll have to start tapping people on the shoulder. But I think it's really important in these times to keep the podcast going. As I say, I think for at least some people, getting their regular podcast feeds will be really important to their feeling of well-being and security and emotional well-being. So that's what I intend to do. I'm going to charge on forward with the podcast, but it might start to sound a little bit different as I record episodes online. But of course, that can only happen if wonderful animal study scholars come forward and allow me to interview them. The final thing I wanted to say is that if you are hearing this episode before the 17th of April, I am one of 3 scholars, before the 14th of April, I'm one of 3 scholars who is currently running a survey into animal studies scholarship and the subdiscipline of animal studies. I'm doing it with Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Yvette Watt. The survey is now live. We really need animal studies scholars to jump on and fill out the survey. It takes between 10 and 15 minutes to complete. A link to the survey is pinned to the top of the Knowing Animals Facebook page. It's also pinned to the top of the Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan Facebook page. And also, I'm very happy to send it to you via Twitter or email, etc. If you don't have Facebook or you can't find the link, please just reach out. Please also share the survey among your networks. Clearly, it's not an ideal time to be running a survey of this type. I know that a lot of people are working very hard to put their courses online and to adapt to working from home and caring for loved ones, etc. But Fiona, Yvette and I have been preparing for this for about a year, and we really, really, really want to try and keep going with this research as best we can. So please, if you can spare 10 to 15 minutes to answer the survey, we'll be so very, very grateful. Okay, that's all for now. Stay safe. Look after each other, look after your animal friends, our animal friends, and enjoy this episode of Knowing Animals. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode is from our Protecting Animals series where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. Now this episode is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA supports animal studies scholars. It also supports animal advocates. It is a really kind of a cross-pollinating organisation, and it wants to support basically anyone who's interested in helping think about animal-related questions and making the world a better place for animals. So check out ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This episode is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Animal Publics is part of Sydney University Press. It has fiction, it has non-fiction, it has all kinds of works there, all about animals. It's got a beautiful, beautiful book just called The Flight of Birds, really beautiful. Actually, I shouldn't have said The Flight of Birds. I think it might be called Birds. Anyway, they've got a beautiful, beautiful fiction book there, all about the lives of birds, which might be relevant to our episode today. So go to the University of Sydney Press and check out Animal Publics. Okay, now this week's episode is a real thrill for me. I'm in beautiful Melbourne town, one of my most favourite places in the whole world. The sun is shining. I'm at my friend Claire McCausland's house, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by a legend of the animal protection movement, certainly in Australia and probably known by people around the world. And that's, of course, Laurie Levy. Now, Laurie, do you say Levy? Do you say Levy?
Levy.
Levy.
Yeah.
Laurie Levy.
Yeah.
Now, Laurie has been working tirelessly to try and end duck shooting in Victoria and around Australia. And he really has campaigned long and hard, as we're going to hear. And so it's such a thrill to have him on the podcast today. Welcome to the podcast, Laurie.
Thank you very much, Siobhan.
Okay, so can you tell us, where did this all begin? What was the start of your journey?
Well, I was a television cameraman for very many years, and I guess I realised working for a Melbourne television channel that just how powerful the media was in bringing about change in society. And so during the 1970s, I was at Channel 9 in those days, I'd worked with Project Jonah to help get whales protected in Australian waters, and that happened in 1980. And then we started working on the rescue of stranded whales, and we flew down to Tasmania to our first stranding, and we learnt a lot, and we helped pioneer the rescue of stranded whales in Australia. It took about 3 or 4 years, but after that we set up a federal whale rescue program and also state whale rescue programs. And of course we became redundant, which was terrific, because that's what you want. Today, if one whale or 100 whales beach anywhere in Australia, state governments go into action to rescue them, and hundreds of volunteers turn up from the public, and it's become very successful. In 1982, we also made a documentary called The Whale Savers, which went to air on the ABC. And I also worked with Greenpeace in 1984-85 to help stop high seas drift net fishing in our northern waters. Those nets were 25 kilometres long, and they were set adrift at dusk and not retrieved until dawn. And of course they caught dolphins and small whales and turtles. But the Hawke government in 1985 banned the use of those big 25 kilometre nets in our waters. And I always thought that the duck issue was pretty horrendous from the bird's point of view. And in 1986 we put our first team together of 15 people to go out to Victoria's wetlands to challenge 100,000 duck shooters. And you might say, well, how can 15 people ever be effective against 100,000 duck shooters? Well, all the media came out with us. And the campaign was based on 2 images. One of a duck shooter in camouflage gear with a semi-automatic or pump action shotgun as they used in those days. And they were shooting down a small defenceless bird. And the opposite to that is a rescuer coming out of the water with a wounded bird in his or her arms, and that image of kindness and compassion will always beat an act of violence in the hearts and minds of the public. And because we got all of that media coverage, the campaign took off overnight. We also took out a mobile veterinary clinic. So we did what was the opposite to what duck shooters did. They were killing, maiming birds, wounding birds, and enjoying it. And so we took out mobile veterinary clinics, and all the wounded birds for the very first time went back to the clinics where vets looked after them, as they would if you were going out to the RSPCA or anywhere else. And it worked well. And the cameras could go into the mobile veterinary clinics to see the vets trying their hardest to save the lives of those birds. You know, some of the injuries those birds receive, it's absolutely horrific. And by exposing that to the media and to the public, public opinion started changing overnight. And of course, all the media coverage went interstate. So people in other states got high on the campaign, and they wanted to go out and rescue birds in their states. And that's how it all started.
Wonderful. Well, Laurie, there's so much in that I want to ask you about and get more details about. But to kick us off, you know, we have a lot of international listeners who may not understand how duck shooting works in Australia. Could you give us a broad sense of, you know, the times of years, the kind of requirements, the kind of birds that are being shot, how many are being shot, that kind of thing?
Well, in the early days, before we started rescuing birds, they could shoot water birds 24 hours a day during a duck shooting season, which went on for 3 months. We had the times changed so that it became a 7 o'clock opening rather than being able to shoot all night. I mean, I don't know, they can't see what they're shooting in the daytime, so I don't know how they ever knew what they were shooting at night. And also, the season goes for 3 months. So we're out there every weekend, and we've been out there right through the whole 34-year campaign, and we have seen results by reducing the numbers of duck shooters from 100,000 down to 25,000 who are licensed, but of those 25, only about 13,000 are active. And in the meantime, we've had duck shooting banned in New South Wales, Western Australia and Queensland.
Wow, good on you. So, Laurie, you know, my background was as an animal advocate before I became an academic. And one of the iconic kind of things I guess one did as an animal protection person was to go to perhaps opening weekend of the duck shooting. I never did it for some reason. I don't know whether it just didn't fit in well with what I was doing or what, but there was always this sense that everyone was going off to duck shooting season or to the start of duck shooting. Can you paint a bit of a picture for listeners of what it's like, you know, the up at pre-dawn, the cold water, what it's like confronting the shooters, all that, and, you know, seeing the beautiful birds shot, etc.?
Well, because the opening time is 7:20 in the morning now, rescuers have to drive often through 4 hours to get to wetlands up in Kerrang, and they often don't get in until 1 o'clock, and they have to be up at 4 o'clock again. What happens before the duck shooting season is we've got rescuers doing surveys of the wetlands to see where the birds are, to see where the threatened species are, and protected species, and we also these days monitor the shooters' websites to see where they're going and what they're going to do. But in the early days, it was a frightening place to be because with 100,000 duck shooters across Victoria, and in Australia there is 6 states, and Western Australia became the first state to ban duck shooting after we went over there in 1990 to help out. The West Australian Conservation Council fought the issue, and we were over there in March, and in September that year, Premier Carmen Lawrence put out a media release to say that duck shooting was being banned, that every year wounded birds are left to die, protected species are being illegally shot, and in those days duck shooters could use lead shot, and lead was polluting the wetlands, and Premier Carmen Lawrence banned the activity outright.
Wonderful. So you paint a very a promising picture in terms of progressive change, and I think that's wonderful. But it strikes me that the powers that be have tried to make it as hard as possible for you and for other duck rescuers to do their business of trying to save ducks. So could you tell us something about the laws around not being in the water and perhaps have you had any skirmishes with the authorities yourself?
We've been in the courts basically for 30 years, and we've fought hundreds of court cases, and we even went to the High Court in 1996 to challenge the Kennett government in those days. But we lost, unfortunately. But when we go to court, I've always played it from two fronts. That when you go to court, you have the legal battle, but you also have get a lot of media coverage on the court case. So even if you win, or even if you lose the legal case, you still win the public relations case. And usually the public relations case is much better to win than the legal side of it.
So we fast forward to the duck shooting season this year in Victoria. You, I guess, don't have trouble finding volunteers who are happy to come out. And then every year, I guess, there are less and less shooters. What was it like this year out in the waters?
Very quiet this year. Very few duck shooters. And basically we've beaten them through attrition. Their numbers have come down steadily from 100,000 in 1986 down to a handful, probably about 8 to 13,000 these days. So it is very quiet. But you couldn't fight a campaign like this without concerned members of the public volunteering for active service. And when people volunteer, you can put a really strong team together because everyone has their own talent. So the mixture of that talent makes it so much easier when you're fighting issues. We don't have committees because committees wind up in turmoil fighting each other. But having a team of volunteers everyone has a different job to do, and they all know what that job is, and they do it so well. And it's the courage and the commitment of our rescue team over the years that has made it possible to bring duck shooting to an end in 3 states, because after Carmen Lawrence banned duck shooting in 1990 in Western Australia, New South Wales followed in 1995, and then Queensland in 2005.
Wonderful. Do you want to give a shout out to any of your volunteers, or is it just too many? It'd be overwhelming. We'd be here all day.
Well, people like Dave Evans, who leads the rescue team on the wetlands, but we have technical specialists out there, and especially with the internet these days, we broadcast live to air as well. But over the years, we've had so much media coverage, which has been television, radio and newspapers, that the campaign has always been out there amongst the public. And you know, when we were out there for the first time, it was a frightening place to be, because duck shooters in those days, in 1986, were using pump action and semi-automatic shotguns. And the violence and the cruelty that was being inflicted on these beautiful native water birds was just horrifying. And that's why we've stayed with the campaign. And we were determined. I mean, you can't walk away, because if we had have walked away at any stage, then there was nobody else to help those birds. So we couldn't turn our backs on them.
So, Laurie, one of the iconic things that you do or have done over many years is to collect up injured birds birds who are shot but not collected by the shooters, and then display them outside Parliament House. Can you say something about the emotional toll that kind of work takes on you? You know, how you find the strength year after year to, you know, find all these bodies and then, you know, care for them, take them, present them, that kind of thing?
It is actually very taxing on people. Mainly not only witnessing the violence and the cruelty, but also picking up wounded birds And of course, rescuers rush them straight back to our mobile veterinary clinic. These days, if rescuers go into the water before 10, which we do, they're fined $1,000 by the government. So, and rescue, the attitude to rescuers is, well, we pay $1,000 to save the lives of birds. But these days also, because of Facebook, we can raise that money back and the public pay our fines for us. But it is horrific out there because, and that's why it was so important we were there, because the public had never seen what actually takes place during a duck shooting season. I mean, the birds are totally defenceless, and the shooters really enjoy what they do out there. They enjoy inflicting that level of violence and cruelty on these beautiful native water birds. And what we've been able to do is touch the hearts and minds of the public. And it's been a long, hard fight, but we're getting very close to the end game now.
So do you know what it is about you that means that you've been able to keep doing this year after year? You know, burnout, of course, is something that does happen a lot in the animal protection movement.
Burnout is it's a problem. And I've burnt out a couple of times. In fact, the driving force originally was the reason I left the job I was doing was because I had open heart surgery in 1979, and I thought I probably only had about 5 years to live. So I wanted to use my skills and what I'd learnt over the years as a cameraman, and to put that to good use to help stop injustices. And in those first 5 years, we set up the whale rescue plan. We also had a couple of farmers prosecuted and jailed for the illegal, or for cruelty to kangaroos. They were doing some horrific things, and that was based on film that had been shot as well. We also had a costume designer for a really great series that was running on television, prosecuted because it was about Indigenous people and they needed costumes. And a friend of the costume designers went out and illegally shot 100 kangaroos for costumes. And we had her prosecuted. And, of course, at the end of 5 years, I was still alive, so I thought, keep going. But during the long 34 years of the duck campaign, knowing you're making a huge impact and a difference out there in helping those birds, that's the thing that keeps you there, and you can't walk away, because you know if you walk away, then the shooters will win.
So,
and it's about winning.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, Laurie, it sounds like you are on the cusp of winning. Can you say more about that? Or, what's the situation at the moment? We've got one, is it only Victoria and Tasmania still shooting?
We've got South Australia, Tasmania and the Northern Territory.
Oh, okay. And you feel that it's going to crumble, or that,
Well, in Victoria now, we're pretty close. The good thing was at the last election, the Andrews government, Labor government, won by a huge margin. Andy Medic from the Animal Justice Party also won a seat in the upper house. And Andy's a terrific campaigner, and he's great in the upper house too. He's articulate. He's great with the media. I'd say he's one of the best speakers in the Victorian Parliament at the moment. And Andy's got a bill sitting up in the upper house ready to ban duck shooting. But of course, we don't have the numbers. And the only way we can win is for the Labor Party to support a ban. And we're pretty close to that now. In fact, last week, Lizzie Blanthorne, a member of the Labor Party, member of Parliament, put put up a motion at Labor State Conference to have a review of the duck shooting season, and there was overwhelming support at the state conference by Labor delegates to have a review, and we feel that now that's in place, Labor will possibly ban duck shooting. And of course, the other thing that's really important here is there are so few duck shooters, small regional towns don't make any money out of them. And if you talk to publicans even in small regional towns, they say they don't make any more money during a duck shooting season. And in 2015, the Auditor General he did a report on small regional towns, on the viability of them, and his report said that most are in serious financial trouble. Now, duck shooters don't bring any money in because there are so few of them, but nature-based tourism is the way to go for small regional towns in Victoria. If you look at Phillip Island was the vision of three Labor politicians in the 1980s, Premier John Cain, Joan Kerner and Evan Walker. And what was happening, Phillip Island was being developed, and developers were building homes to sell right on top of the penguins' burrows. So they saw it as a major problem, and their vision was to protect the penguins. They bought all the homes back, and not only to protect the penguins, but to establish what would become a thriving nature-based tourism industry down at Phillip Island. And their vision was successful on three fronts. They saved the penguins, and they set up a major thriving nature-based tourism industry down there that sees over 1 million visitors each year, and including 170,000 Chinese tourists.
Wonderful. Well, Laurie, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Okay.
Can you recall, and you might have already said a bit about this, but can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
I've probably thought that all my life. But as I said before, being in the television industry and being a cameraman, I look at campaigns through the eyes of a camera. And when you go out to a duck shooting opening, you've got a lot of actors out there. You've got shooters out there. You've got the rescuers. You've got the bad guys in the shooters. You've got the good guys in the rescuers. And these days, of course, you have the police out there. You have the Game Management Authority compliance officers out there. And by the way, they can't go into the water to police the duck shooting season because of occupational health and safety regulations. So it's our rescuers that are doing the hard work, and we're out there with the shooters. And in 2011, we had a rescuer shot in the face, and she was extremely lucky because she had 9 pellets in her face, and they missed both sides of her eyes by centimetres. And but it is dangerous out there. But the important thing is the media coverage. That's where we've been able to. That's why we've been able to succeed.
Absolutely. So, can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change and make the world a better place for animals?
Well, with in the 1970s, when I worked with Project Jonah, my role with them was to advise on media. And when we went down to rescue whales for the first time in 1981, it became a frontline issue. And again, we couldn't have succeeded without the volunteers being down there to help us, and people were passionate about working with whales. and they are great to work with. They know what you're doing and they actually help you. And also the media coverage, because every time there was a stranding, the media would be there, and that put out the call for volunteers.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, the people who have had a big impact, going back to the start, would have been Martin Luther King in his civil rights activism. Martin Luther King was a great orator, but also he understood the power of the camera, and it was only in 1960 that television news were using portable cameras, and of course he was a great campaigner and had a great victory out of it. Greenpeace always inspired me in the 70s, and Paul Watson. So the other inspiration were two Washington Post journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they worked at the Washington Post and uncovered the story about corruption in office, in the high office, and it forced Richard Nixon. So their stories, their persistence in chasing down stories, forced the President of the United States then, Richard Nixon, to resign. So it's usually journos that have been the great inspiration over the years.
Wonderful. Well, Laurie, what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
I just think the most important thing now is to keep pressure on state governments to ban duck shooting. As I said before, tourism is, and the good thing is the Andrews Labor government is really involved, and they can see that, and especially Daniel Andrews, that small regional towns need tourism to survive into the future. And as well as the penguins, the Great Ocean Road tourism brings in $1.7 billion to towns between Torquay and Warrnambool every year. Sea Lake was a dying town in the Wimmera, in the northern parts of the Wimmera, and people were closing up shop and leaving the town until Chinese tourists started arriving. And because of that, the tourism industry started at Sea Lake. They were going to Lake Tyrrell to see all the stars and the pink lake, and it all happened by accident. But Daniel Andrews and the Labor government was quick enough to see that it could be a thriving tourism industry up there. The government put in $2.3 million, and they expect 192,000 tourists by 2025 to visit the town of Sea Lake. And that's what it's all about. So the future is in nature-based tourism. The past, well, duck shooting belongs in the 1950s.
Absolutely. And it's also good to remember that animal advocates aren't out trying to make the world a bad place for people, take people's jobs and blah. You know, we're very interested in alternatives. You know, we want people to have an income and for regional towns and farmers to thrive, but just without the suffering. So final question, Laurie. If you had the power to change one thing about the relationship between human and non-human animals, what would it be?
Well, I'd like to see a situation where animals have the power to go to court to fight
wonderful.
back. I mean, it is a power situation where most species are totally defenceless. I guess my passion has been fighting for wildlife over the years, and that's all starting to change now.
Fantastic. Well, Laurie, I really do feel very optimistic that we're on the cusp of a ban, perhaps total ban across Australia. duck shooting, which will be fantastic and largely down to you. But it does make me wonder what you're going to do with yourself once that happens. What are you working on next?
I'll take a couple of days off, I think. Oh, look, I don't know. I don't know how much more time I've got.
Yeah.
But,
you look pretty. To me, it looks like you've got another good few battles in you.
Well, I've had open heart surgery twice now. Right. So, and I feel really fit. I keep myself fit. Yeah. And I'm still working well. Yeah. And I'm still fighting well. So we might continue on. Yeah. Once it's banned in Victoria, we'll probably help over in South Australia and Tasmania and have a look at the Northern Territory. Yes, yeah. And we might even have a look at the kangaroo situation.
Oh, so plenty of work to be done, sadly. So where can people find out more about your duck rescue group?
Well, if they go to our Facebook page, which is just the Coalition Against Duck Shooting, or go to our website at www.duck.org.au.
Oh, very nice. Now, and if people are feeling generous, it is around, when this episode comes out, it'll be very much around the Christmas time, a time of giving. People can make a donation?
Yeah. Yes, people can make a donation to the coalition, and look, the people who donate to the campaign are as committed to helping those birds as the rescuers are. And of course, we don't have tax deductibility, and we chose not to do that because we need to be able to fight our campaign without fear or favour of upsetting governments. So we don't take tax deductibility.
Wonderful. Well, Laurie, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about their work. Don't forget to follow us on the internet at Twitter at knowing_animals or at Facebook at Knowing Animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.